I want to be careful about how I say this because I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just going to explain what happened the way I remember it, in the order I remember it, and I'll try to be honest when I'm not sure about something. That's the best I can do. I've thought about whether I should even talk about this at all, and I keep going back and forth. But I think it's better to say it out loud than to keep turning it over in my head. That's part of what I've learned, that turning things over doesn't always help. Sometimes it does the opposite. My name is Aaron Kessler. I'm 38. I've been a forest ranger with the Pacific Northwest Division for 11 years. Before that, I did 2 seasons with AmeriCorps doing trail restoration in Montana, and before that, I was just a kid who liked being outside more than being around people. I say all this because I want you to understand that I'm not new to this kind of work. I've spent months alone in fire lookouts. I've done winter patrols in places where the nearest person was a 4-hour snowshoe trek away. I know what isolation feels like. I know what it does to your thinking, your sleep patterns, your sense of time. I've always handled it well. That was one of the things they noted in my evaluations, that I was psychologically well suited for long-duration solo assignments. Stable, low reactive. Those were words that appeared in my file. I'm telling you that because I need you to understand that what I'm about to describe isn't the result of someone falling apart in the woods. I didn't fall apart. I'm still not sure anything happened at all, at least not in a way I could prove or point to. That's exactly the problem. In March of last year, I was reassigned. My supervisor, a woman named Carla Devereaux, called me into the district office in Forks and told me that a monitoring position had opened up at a site called the Relay Basin. I'd never heard of it, which was unusual because I thought I had a decent mental map of every managed area within 200 miles. Carla said it was a restricted zone, about 4,600 acres, that had been under periodic observation for several years, but had recently been reclassified for continuous monitoring. She didn't say who reclassified it. She said the assignment would be 9 months minimum, that I'd be stationed at a small cabin on the eastern perimeter, and that my duties would consist of daily patrol routes along 3 designated trails, daily observation logging, and weekly radio reports to a relay station she referred to only as dispatch. I asked her what I'd be monitoring for. She said, ecological activity and compliance with restricted access protocols. Then she handed me a folder. The folder was thin. It had a 1-page assignment summary, a topographic map of the basin with 3 patrol routes marked in blue ink, a frequency chart for my radio, and a single sheet of guidelines titled Operational Parameters. I read through the guidelines that night in my motel room. They were straightforward. Stay on the marked routes. Complete each route at least once per week. Log all observations in the provided field journal using the standardized format. Report weekly to dispatch on Thursdays at 00800. Do not enter areas marked in red on the topographic map. Do not deviate from patrol routes without authorization. That last part. The red areas. I looked at the map again and saw that there were 4 irregular shapes drawn in red, scattered across the interior of the basin. They weren't labeled. They didn't correspond to any geographic features I could identify from the contour lines. I made a note to ask Carla about them, but when I went back to the office the next morning, she was already gone. The woman at the front desk said Carla was on leave and that I could direct any questions to dispatch once I was on site. I drove out to the Relay Basin on March 14th. The access road was a single-lane gravel track that branched off a Forest Service road about 20 miles east of the Sol Duc corridor. There was no gate, no sign, just a gap in the trees where the road bent north and narrowed until branches scraped both sides of my truck. The drive took about 45 minutes. The cabin was at the end of the road, set back into a clearing that faced a long slope of old-growth Douglas fir. It was small, one room, a wood stove, a cot, a table, a shelf with a radio and a propane lantern. There was a rainwater cistern on the north side and an outhouse about 30 yards into the tree line. Everything was clean, stocked, maintained. Someone had been here recently, though I never found out who. I unpacked, tested the radio, confirmed frequency with dispatch. The voice on the other end was male, calm, and very brief. He confirmed my call sign, Relay 1, and told me to begin patrol routes the following morning. He didn't introduce himself. I asked if there was a name I should use, and he said, "Dispatch is fine." I asked about the red zones on the map. There was a pause, and then he said, "Restricted areas, flagged for ecological sensitivity. Just stay on your routes." Then he signed off. I want to say that none of this seemed strange to me at the time. Government work is like this. You get partial information. You get vague guidelines written by someone who's never been to the place they're describing. You learn to fill in the blanks yourself, or you learn to stop asking. And I'd been doing this long enough that I defaulted to the second option. I figured I'd understand the area better once I started walking it. The first few weeks were, genuinely, some of the most peaceful of my career. The basin was beautiful. It was dense, temperate rainforest. Enormous firs, Sitka spruce, western red cedar, with a thick understory of sword fern and salal. There were elk trails cutting through the lower elevations, and signs of black bear activity near a creek that ran along the southern boundary of my patrol area. The three routes covered different sections of the basin. Route A ran roughly north-south through a gentle valley. Route B looped around a ridgeline to the west. Route C followed the creek south and then cut east through a flat, mossy area I started calling the Shelf because the ground there had a strange, almost leveled quality, like a plateau that shouldn't have existed given the terrain around it. My daily routine was simple. I'd wake at 6, eat, check the weather, then choose a route for the day. I'd hike the full route, usually 5 to 7 miles depending on pace and stops. And I'd log everything I observed. The log format was specific: time, GPS coordinates, weather, flora observations, fauna observations, ground condition, water level at creek crossings, and a final field labeled anomalies. I wasn't sure what that last one meant exactly, but I assumed it referred to anything out of the ordinary. Downed trees, illegal campsites, damaged trail markers. For the first several weeks, I left that field blank. I settled into the rhythm of the place. I learned where the elk bedded down. I tracked a particular doe who had a distinctive notch in her left ear. I learned which sections of Route B got muddy after rain and which sections of Route C had the best light in the early afternoon. I learned the sounds, the way the wind moved through the canopy in layers, the way the creek changed pitch depending on recent rainfall, the particular silence that settled in the late evenings when even the birds stopped. It was good work. I felt useful. I felt calm. I made my weekly reports to dispatch every Thursday. They were brief. I'd read my log summaries, and the voice would confirm receipt, occasionally ask a follow-up question, usually about water levels or elk count, and sign off. I never spoke to the same voice twice in a row, or at least I don't think I did. The voices were similar enough that I couldn't be sure. I asked once if there was a staff rotation at dispatch, and the voice said, "We're fully staffed." That wasn't an answer, but I let it go. In the fourth week, I noticed something that I want to describe very carefully, because this is where I start to lose confidence in my own account. I was hiking Route C, the one that follows the creek. There's a section about 2 miles in where the trail crosses the water over a natural rock bridge. Just a flat slab of basalt that juts out over a narrow point in the creek. I'd crossed it maybe a dozen times by then. I knew it well. I knew there was a particular cedar on the far bank that leaned at an angle over the trail, and I knew that just past that cedar, there was a patch of oxalis growing at the base of a nurse log. On this particular morning, I crossed the bridge and the cedar was there, leaning just as it always did, but the oxalis was gone. Not dead. Gone. The nurse log was there, but the ground around it was bare. Bare soil, a few pebbles, no vegetation at all. I crouched down and looked at it. The soil didn't look disturbed. There were no drag marks, no sign of animal activity. It just looked like nothing had ever grown there. I wrote it in my log under anomalies. I wrote, "Oxalis patch absent at nurse log near creek crossing, Route C, mile 2.1. No sign of disturbance. Possibly misremembering location." That last sentence is important. I want you to notice that my first instinct was to doubt myself. That's a reasonable instinct. Memory is unreliable. I know that. Anyone who spends long periods alone knows how easy it is to blur one day into another, to transpose details, to remember something that was actually from a different hike on a different day. I didn't think much of it. 2 days later, I hiked Route C again. The oxalis was back. Same spot, same nurse log. Thick, green, well-established, as if it had been growing there for months. I stood over it for a long time. I crouched down and touched it. It was real. It was fine. I looked at my previous log entry. I'd written that it was absent. I was looking at it now, and it was present. I logged it. Oxalis patch present at nurse log, Route C, mile 2.1. No change from previous baseline. And then I crossed that out and wrote, "Correction. Patch was absent during last observation. Now present. No explanation." I stared at what I'd written and felt something I want to describe accurately. It wasn't fear. It was more like a small door opening in my chest, a little draft coming through. And then I closed the door. That's the best way I can put it. I decided it wasn't important. I decided I had been wrong before, and now I was right, and there was nothing else to consider. I moved on. The next few weeks brought more of these moments, but they were small and spaced apart enough that each one, individually, could be explained. A blaze mark on Route B, that I was sure had been on the left side of a particular tree, was now on the right side. A section of Route A where the trail passed between 2 large boulders. Except one day, there were 3 boulders, and the next time, there were 2 again. The creek, which I had been carefully measuring at 3 different points, gave me readings that didn't follow any logical pattern relative to rainfall. One week, we'd had heavy rain for 4 straight days, and the creek was lower than I'd ever recorded it. The next week, bone dry, and the creek was up 6 inches. Each of these things, on its own, was nothing. A misread measurement, a faulty memory, a blaze mark I'd seen from a different angle. I kept logging them under anomalies, because that's what the form asked me to do, and I kept offering myself explanations because that's what a rational person does. But here's the thing I need to explain. And this is where it gets difficult. It wasn't just that these inconsistencies existed. It was what happened when I tried to think about them together. When I tried to sit at my table in the evening and line up all the anomalies side by side and look for a pattern, something happened to my thinking. It's very hard to describe. It wasn't confusion exactly. It was more like the thought would start to form and then it would dissolve. Not violently, not painfully. It just wouldn't hold together. Like trying to carry water in your hands, you can feel it there and then it's gone. And you're standing with your hands open and you can't quite remember what you were doing. I started keeping a separate notebook. I wrote things down so I wouldn't have to hold them in my head. I made lists. I drew little diagrams. I wrote questions like, why was the oxalis gone and then back? And check boulder count on Route A next time. And this worked to some extent. The notebook held the thoughts that my mind wouldn't. But even the notebook started to feel strange. I'd flip back through earlier pages and find entries I didn't remember writing. Not that I didn't remember the content. I didn't remember the act of writing them. There was one entry from what the date said was April 22nd that read, "Third time on Route B West Ridge. Sound from the second red zone. Low, constant, not wind, not water. Stopped when I stopped walking." I read that entry and I felt absolutely nothing. No recognition, no memory of that day, of that sound, of writing those words. But it was my handwriting. I want to stop here and say something about how this felt on a daily basis, because I think that's important. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a crisis. Most of the time, I felt fine. I'd wake up, make coffee, do my route, eat lunch, write my log, read in the afternoon, do some maintenance around the cabin, eat dinner, sleep. The days were long and quiet and mostly good. The strangeness was in the margins. It was at the edges of things, in the moments between tasks, in the few minutes before sleep, when my mind would drift toward questions I'd told myself to stop asking, and in the morning, I'd feel fine again, and the questions would seem less important, and I'd go about my work. I reported the anomalies to dispatch. Not all of them, but the ones I felt were most concrete. The creek readings, mainly. The voice on the other end would say, "Noted," or "We'll flag that for review," and then move on to the next topic. Once, when I mentioned the boulder discrepancy on Route A, there was a silence on the line that went on long enough for me to check the connection. Then the voice said, "Geological features can appear different depending on light conditions and approach angle. Log it and continue." That was reasonable. That was probably true. I said copy, and we moved on. But after that call, I sat at the table and thought about the phrase log it and continue. And I realized that was basically what I'd been told to do about everything. Every question I raised, every inconsistency I reported. The answer was always some variation of log it and continue. Note it and move on. File it and keep going. The system had a place for anomalies. There was a field on the form. The form absorbed the anomaly, and then the anomaly was processed, and then I moved on to the next day. The system worked perfectly, as long as I didn't try to do anything with the information beyond logging it. I need to talk about the red zones now. There were 4 of them on the map, as I mentioned. Irregular shapes, roughly circular, scattered through the interior of the basin. My patrol routes went near them, but never through them. Route B, in particular, skirted the edge of 2 of them. The map showed them clearly enough, but there was nothing on the ground to indicate their boundaries. No fencing, no markers, no signs. If you didn't have the map, you wouldn't know they were there. For the first couple of months, I respected the boundaries without much thought. Restricted areas in managed forests aren't unusual. They could be protecting a sensitive archaeological site, a nesting area for an endangered species, a soil remediation zone, any number of things. I didn't need to know the reason. I just needed to stay on my routes. But as the anomalies accumulated, I started paying more attention to the red zones, not entering them. just noticing things about them. The forest inside them, as far as I could see from the trail, looked exactly like the forest outside them. Same trees, same understory, same light filtering through the canopy. There was no visual difference, but I started noticing that certain anomalies seemed to cluster near the red zone boundaries. The boulder situation on Route A was within 100 yards of one. The oxalis patch on Route C was near another. The creek readings that didn't make sense, the measurement point closest to a red zone, was always the one that diverged the most from expected levels. I want to be clear that I noticed this pattern, and then I stopped noticing it. I don't mean I forgot about it. I mean, I made a conscious decision to stop thinking about it, and I was sitting at the table one evening in May, looking at my map with little pencil marks showing where the anomalies had occurred, and I could see the correlation with the red zones forming right in front of me. And I felt that door in my chest open again. That little draft. And this time, instead of just closing it, I put the map away. I folded it up, put it in the folder, put the folder in my bag, and went outside and chopped wood until it was dark. I slept very well that night. I remember that specifically. I slept deeply and without dreams, and in the morning I felt rested and clear, and I went on my patrol and I didn't think about the map or the red zones or the correlation, and everything was fine. Everything was completely fine. The thing about long-term isolation is that you develop a relationship with your own mind. It's the only company you have, so you learn to manage it the way you'd manage a difficult roommate. You learn which topics lead to arguments. You learn when to change the subject. You learn that some thoughts are productive and some thoughts are not. And you develop an instinct for steering away from the unproductive ones before they gain momentum. This is normal. This is healthy. Every ranger I've ever known does some version of this. But what I was doing, and I can see this now, looking back, was slightly different. I wasn't just avoiding unproductive thoughts. I was avoiding a specific category of thought. Any thought that tried to connect the anomalies to each other, any thought that tried to establish a pattern, any thought that asked why instead of what. I learned to feel those thoughts coming the way you feel a sneeze coming, and I learned to suppress them at the same moment. And the suppression felt good. It felt like relief. It felt like putting down something heavy. June was warm and dry. The forest floor crackled underfoot. I saw a black bear sow with 2 cubs near the creek on Route C, and I logged it, and I felt happy. I remember feeling happy. The work was simple and clear. Walk the route. Write down what you see. Report on Thursday. Don't enter the red zones. These were good rules. They made sense. They gave my days a shape that I could rely on. But the anomalies didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent, and they started involving things that were harder to explain away. I'm going to list some of them here, not because any single one was significant, but because the accumulation is important. On June 3rd, I hiked Route A and counted the trail markers. There were 23. I know this because I'd counted them twice before and gotten 23 both times. On June 10th, I counted 26. On June 14th, 23 again. The trail hadn't been maintained by anyone but me. No new markers had been installed. None were damaged or removed. There were simply 3 more markers. And then there weren't. On June 8th, I found a footprint in the mud near the creek crossing on Route C. It was a boot print, size 10 or 11, with a lug pattern I didn't recognize. I hadn't seen any sign of another person in the basin since I arrived. I photographed it, logged it, and reported it to dispatch. The voice said, "Probably a historic print preserved in the substrate. Log it and continue." I looked at the print again. It was crisp, clean, fresh. The mud around it was soft and wet from yesterday's rain. But I said, "Copy," and I continued. On June 15th, I was sitting in the cabin at the dusk, writing my log, and I heard a sound from the north. It was faint, rhythmic, and completely regular, like a metronome. Not mechanical. It didn't have that quality. It sounded organic, but too regular to be natural. I sat and listened for about 10 minutes. It didn't change pitch, volume, or tempo. Then it stopped, not gradually. It simply ceased in the middle of a beat, as if someone had pressed a button. I went outside and listened. Nothing. Just the wind, the faint sound of the creek in the distance, the usual evening sounds. I went back inside and wrote it in my log under anomalies. Rhythmic sound from north, approximately 2100 hours, duration 10 minutes, unidentified. I want to tell you what I felt when I wrote that because it's the closest I can come to explaining the central problem. I felt fine, I felt calm, I wrote it down and I moved on, but there was a part of me, a very small, very quiet part, that was saying, "Aaron, you should think about this." And there was another part of me, a much larger part, that said, "No." And the larger part won easily, without effort, the way gravity wins. And I went to bed. I started dreaming more in July, not nightmares. Nothing so clear or dramatic, just long, looping dreams in which I was walking my patrol routes, doing exactly what I did during the day, except that things were slightly different. The trail would be 5 degrees off from where it should be. A tree I knew well would be a different species. The creek would be flowing in the wrong direction. In the dreams, I noticed these things, and I felt the same mild discomfort I felt during waking hours. And I did the same thing I did during waking hours. I noted the discrepancy and moved on. I'd wake up in the morning not sure whether certain memories were from the dream or from the actual previous day. I'd have to check my log to confirm what I'd actually observed. This is where I need to talk about something that I haven't told anyone about before, and it's the part that I keep coming back to when I try to understand what was happening. In mid-July, I decided to test something. I'd been thinking, despite my best efforts, not to about the relationship between the anomalies and the red zones. I couldn't shake the correlation I'd noticed before, so I decided, very deliberately, to walk Route B and pay close, systematic attention to everything I observed as I passed near the 2 red zones on that route. I would take detailed notes, I would measure things, I would be scientific about it. I set out in the morning with my pack, my notebook, my measuring tape, my compass, and my GPS. I hiked the first 2 miles of Route B without incident, logging everything meticulously. Temperature, humidity, wind speed, canopy cover, trail condition, marker count. Everything was normal. Everything was consistent with my prior observations. Then I reached the section where the trail curves west and passes within about 50 yards of the first red zone. And I did something I'd never done before. I stopped. I stood on the trail and looked into the forest in the direction of the red zone. I couldn't see anything different about it. Same trees, same understory, same filtered light. But I stood there and I let myself think about it. I let myself ask the question, what is in there? What happened next is the part I can't describe well. I was standing on the trail. I was thinking about the red zone. And then I was sitting on a rock about a quarter mile further up the trail, and the light had changed. It had been mid-morning when I stopped. Now the sun was high, noon, maybe later. My notebook was open on my knee, and I had written a full page of notes. I looked down at them. They were detailed, thorough observations of the trail section I was currently sitting in, soil composition, moisture level, lichen species on the nearby rocks, the distance between trail markers 17 and 18. All perfectly clear, perfectly useful data. But I had no memory of collecting it. I had no memory of walking from the spot where I'd stopped to the rock where I was sitting. There was a gap, not a fuzzy gap, not a faded memory, but a clean, sharp absence, like a piece of tape cut from a reel. I sat there for a long time. I read the notes again. They were in my handwriting. The data was consistent with what I could observe around me. There was nothing wrong with the notes. They were, by any measure, good work. They just hadn't been written by me. Or they had been written by me, but by a version of me that I hadn't been present for. That little door in my chest opened very wide that afternoon. I could feel the draft all through me, and I closed it. I closed it hard, the way you'd slam a door against a storm. I put the notebook away. I finished the route on autopilot. I went back to the cabin, made dinner, wrote my log, and went to bed. I did not report this to dispatch. I did not write it in my anomaly field. I pretended it hadn't happened. And here's the thing that scares me most. It worked. Pretending it hadn't happened worked. The next day, I felt fine. I did my route, I wrote my log, everything was normal. The day after that, same thing. The gap in my memory was still there. I could still feel the absence when I looked at it directly, but it was easy not to look at it directly. It was the easiest thing in the world. August was hot, even in the shade of the canopy. I carried more water on my routes and started earlier to avoid the midday heat. The forest was dry, and I spent some time assessing fire risk, which was a welcome practical task that occupied my mind in a useful way. I reported elevated fire conditions to dispatch, and they acknowledged it and reminded me to maintain clearance around the cabin. Normal work. Good, clear, normal work. But the anomalies continued, and they were getting harder to dismiss. They were still small, still individually explainable, but they had started to involve my equipment. On August 4th, my GPS showed me at a location that was half a mile east of where I actually was. I could see the creek, which meant I was on Route C, but the GPS coordinates corresponded to a spot on the interior of the basin, near one of the red zones. I turned it off and on again. When it restarted, it showed the correct location. On August 11th, my compass, which I keep as a backup, was off by about 15 degrees. I checked it against the GPS bearing and adjusted, but it was the first time in 11 years that compass had read wrong. On August 19th, my watch, a simple digital watch, nothing fancy, was an hour ahead. I knew this because I'd set it by the radio the previous Thursday. Watches drift, but not an hour in 5 days. I reset it and didn't think about it. I'm lying. I did think about it. I thought about it while I was chopping wood that evening, and the thought went like this. The GPS was wrong. The compass was wrong. The watch was wrong. All three instruments are telling me I'm somewhere I'm not, or that the time is something it isn't. What if... And that's where I stopped. I stopped the thought. I put the axe down, and I went inside, and I ate dinner, and I read a chapter of a paperback I'd brought with me. A spy novel, something completely absorbing and mindless, and I did not finish the thought. But I'll finish it now, or try to. What if the instruments were right? What if the GPS was accurately reporting its location, and that location simply wasn't where I thought I was? What if the compass was correct, and north had moved? What if the watch was right, and I'd lost an hour somewhere? I can feel even now The way that line of thinking wants to collapse. It wants to fold in on itself and disappear. There's a sensation that comes with it, a kind of mental vertigo, like looking down from a height. The thought is there, and it's clear, and it makes a certain kind of sense. And then the sense evaporates, not because the thought is wrong, but because. And this is the part I can't explain. The framework in which the thought would make sense doesn't seem to exist. It's like trying to solve an equation when the math itself doesn't work. The numbers are there, but addition doesn't do what addition is supposed to do. I know how that sounds. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a forest ranger. I count trail markers and measure creek levels and log what I see. I'm not equipped to think about things like this, and I've started to wonder if that's the point. If maybe the people who gave me this assignment understood something about me that I didn't. That I was the kind of person who would log the anomalies and keep walking. That I would close the door and chop wood. That I would reset the watch and eat dinner and not finish the thought. September arrived, and with it, the first fall rains. The forest changed character overnight. Greener, more alive, the understory expanding as moisture returned. I should have been refreshed by it. Usually the fall rains are my favorite time in the Pacific Northwest. But I was tired. Not physically. I was in good shape, well-fed, sleeping regular hours. The tiredness was somewhere else. Behind my eyes, maybe, in the place where thoughts form. It felt like that place had been overworked, not from thinking too much, but from the effort of not thinking. Like a muscle held in one position for too long. I started making small changes to my routine that I told myself were practical. I stopped counting trail markers. I stopped measuring the creek at the third point, the one closest to the red zone, because my notebook was running out of pages and I needed to economize. I stopped checking my compass against the GPS. I stopped writing in the anomaly field on my log unless something was truly obvious, which, by that point, nothing seemed to be. Everything had taken on a quality of being just ambiguous enough to ignore. And here's the really insidious part. I started to feel better. As I dropped each of these practices, as I deliberately narrowed my attention to the simplest, most routine aspects of my work, the tiredness behind my eyes began to lift. The little door in my chest stayed closed. I walked my routes and I saw what was there, and I wrote it down, and I didn't compare it to what had been there before. I lived in the present tense. Each day was its own thing, complete and self-contained, and it didn't need to connect to the days before it. I know what that sounds like. It sounds like I was training myself not to notice, and I was. But I need you to understand that it felt like healing. It felt like getting better. It felt like I had been making myself sick by overthinking. And now I was recovering by learning to let go. In October, something happened that I cannot explain and that I am going to tell you about as plainly as I can. I was on Route A. It was a Tuesday, overcast, light rain. I had been walking for about 2 hours and was in the northern section of the route, near the boundary of the basin. This was a section I'd walked dozens of times. I knew every tree, every rock, every turn in the trail. At a certain point, the trail descends through a series of switchbacks into a shallow ravine, and at the bottom of the ravine, there's a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across, where a windfall opened up the canopy a few years back. I'd logged this clearing many times. I'd described it in my reports. It was a known feature. I came down the switchbacks, and the clearing was not there. The trail continued straight through dense, unbroken forest. Old-growth trees, heavy canopy, no gap, no windfall, no clearing. The trees that were there were massive, 4-5 feet in diameter. They hadn't grown there recently. They had been there for centuries. The clearing had never existed, except it had because I'd stood in it. I'd eaten lunch in it. I'd logged it as a reference point. I had coordinates for it. I checked my GPS. It said I was at the exact coordinates where the clearing should be. I was standing in the right place. But the place was wrong, or I was wrong, or my memory was wrong, or the coordinates were wrong, or the forest was wrong. I stood there in the rain among those ancient trees, and I felt the door blow open. Not a draft this time. A full, wide opening, and behind it was something I can only describe as a question so large that it didn't have edges. It wasn't, "Where is the clearing?" It was bigger than that. It was something like, "What are the rules here?" And underneath that, "Were there ever rules?" And underneath that, "What am I standing in?" I couldn't close the door. I tried. I tried to do what I'd been doing for months. To note it and move on. To log it and continue. To close the door and chop wood. But the door wouldn't close. The thought kept expanding. If the clearing wasn't here, had it ever been here? If it hadn't, then what had I been standing in all those other times? If it had, then where was it now? If the GPS was right and the forest was right, then what was wrong? If nothing was wrong, then what was I afraid of? I stood there for 10 minutes or 20 minutes or an hour. I don't know. Time had taken on that uncertain quality again. And then, and this is the part I keep turning over and over, the thought collapsed. Not because I suppressed it, not because I chose to stop. It collapsed on its own, like a wave breaking. One moment it was this enormous, overwhelming question, and the next moment it was just a man standing in the rain among some trees, slightly confused, slightly cold, wanting to get back to the cabin and dry off. The intensity of the question simply evaporated, and I was left feeling empty and calm. I hiked back to the cabin. I sat at the table. I opened my log. Under anomalies, I wrote, "Clearing at Route A, mile 4.3, not observed. Possible misidentification of location. Will verify on next patrol." I wrote that knowing it was a lie. Not a lie about the clearing. I genuinely didn't know what to say about the clearing, but a lie about the next patrol. I knew that when I next hiked Route A, I would not verify. I would walk past that section and I would not look. And if the clearing was there, I would note it. And if it wasn't, I would note that. And neither observation would mean anything because I would not connect it to anything else. It would be an isolated data point, floating in space attached to nothing. Is that how it's supposed to work? I'm asking genuinely, is that what they want? Is the system designed so that each observation is separate? Each day is separate? Each report is separate? Is the whole point that nobody ever puts it together? Because the form has a field for anomalies, and the anomalies get logged, and the logs get reported, and the reports get acknowledged, and then nothing happens. The anomalies go into the system and the system absorbs them, and they disappear. The system is a clearing that was there and now isn't. The system is 23 trail markers, and then 26, and then 23. The system is log it and continue, spoken in a calm voice by someone who might be a different person every time, or might be the same person, and it doesn't matter, because the instruction is always the same. I'm sorry. I'm getting away from the facts. Let me come back to the facts. In late October, I had my first missed report. I don't mean I forgot. I was sitting at the radio on Thursday at 0800, ready to transmit. I keyed the mic and called for dispatch. No response. I tried again. Nothing. I tried on the backup frequency. Nothing. I went through the standard troubleshooting protocol. checked the connections, checked the antenna, checked the power supply. Everything was functioning. The radio was working. Dispatch just wasn't there. I tried again at 900, 1000, and 1100. Nothing. At noon, I gave up and went on my patrol. When I came back, I tried once more at 1600. This time, the voice answered immediately, as if it had been waiting. "Relay 1, this is dispatch. Go ahead with your report." I said, "I've been trying to reach you since 800. There was a pause. Then, "We show your last contact as 0800 today. Report received and acknowledged. Do you have additional traffic?" I sat with the mic in my hand and thought about what to say. I hadn't made a report at 0800. I had tried and failed. But the dispatch had a record of receiving one. I thought about pushing back, about insisting that I hadn't made contact that morning. But what would I say? What would I be alleging? That someone else had filed my report? That dispatch had manufactured a report? That the 0800 call had happened but I hadn't been present for it, the way I hadn't been present for the notes in my notebook back in July? "Negative," I said. "No additional traffic. Relay 1 out." After that, I started paying attention to the reports differently, not the content. I still kept them routine, still read my log summaries, still answered the follow-up questions about creek levels and elk counts. But I started paying attention to whether the information dispatch reflected back to me matched what I'd actually said. And it always did, almost. There would be small discrepancies. A number slightly off, a date shifted by a day, a GPS coordinate that was close but not exactly what I'd reported. Each one was within the range of transcription error. Each one was explainable, but they were always there. Every report had at least one. I mentioned this once. I said, "Dispatch, I want to confirm the elk count from last week's report. I reported 6, but the acknowledgement reflected 7. The voice said, "Checking." A pause. "We show 7, consistent with your report dated Thursday, October 16th. My report was dated October 17th, I said. Thursday was the 17th. Another pause. "Confirmed. October 17th. 7 elk. Is there a discrepancy?" "No," I said. "No discrepancy." Because there wasn't. There wasn't a discrepancy you could hold in your hands. It was the kind of thing that could be a typo, a slip of the tongue, a miscommunication. It was the kind of thing that a reasonable person would let go, and I was a reasonable person. That was increasingly the thing I held on to most tightly. The belief that I was a reasonable person, behaving reasonably in a situation that was reasonable. November was cold. The first frost came early, and I spent time winterizing the cabin, sealing gaps, stacking firewood, checking the stove. Physical work. Good, solid, uncomplicated physical work. I spent less time on my routes and more time around the cabin, which was consistent with the shorter days and colder temperatures. I told myself this was practical, but I think the truth is that I had started to be slightly afraid of the routes, not of anything on the routes. There was never anything to be afraid of on the routes, nothing visible, nothing tangible, but of what the routes might show me, and of what I might have to decide not to think about. There was one day in November. I don't remember the exact date, and that bothers me because I used to remember every date. When I was hiking Route C, and I realized that I was not on Route C. The trail I was walking was familiar. It felt like Route C. It had the right general character. The creek was on my left, the terrain was rising slightly to the west, but the specific features were wrong. The nurse log was on the wrong side of the trail. The rock bridge was wider than it should have been. The cedar that leaned over the trail was a fir. I stopped and checked my map. The route was correct. The trail markers, which I had stopped counting but which I now noticed, had the right blaze color for Route C. My GPS confirmed I was on Route C. Everything that was supposed to tell me where I was said I was on Route C. But the forest around me was not the forest I had walked through for 8 months. I want to describe what I did next because I think it says something important about what was happening to me. I didn't panic. I didn't even feel particularly alarmed. I felt tired. I felt a deep, heavy tiredness that started in my chest and spread outward. And I thought, I can't do this right now. And I turned around and walked back to the cabin and went to sleep, even though it was the middle of the afternoon. And when I woke up, it was the next morning, and I felt fine, and I went out and hiked Route C, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. The nurse log was on the correct side. The rock bridge was the right width. The cedar was a cedar. Everything was fine. I logged it as a normal patrol. No anomalies. I don't know when I stopped being honest in my logs. It wasn't a decision. It was a gradual process, like erosion. At first, I was meticulous about recording every inconsistency. Then I started qualifying them. Possibly misremembered. Likely due to lighting conditions. Will verify. Then I started omitting the small ones. Then I started omitting the medium ones. By November, I was only logging things that were so obvious I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen them. And by that point, almost nothing reached that threshold. Because the threshold had moved. What would have been alarming in March was unremarkable in November. I had recalibrated, I had adapted, and the adaptation felt like competence. It felt like I was getting better at my job. I had one conversation with dispatch in November that I want to tell you about. It was a Thursday report, routine, nothing unusual. I'd given my summaries and the voice had acknowledged them. And then, at the end, almost as an afterthought, I asked, "How much longer is my assignment here?" The voice said, "Your assignment duration is determined by management review. Is there a concern?" "No," I said. "Just wondering about timing for winter. Your provisions and winterization supplies are adequate for continued operations. Is there anything else?" "No, relay 1 out." I sat by the radio for a long time after that conversation. I was trying to figure out what bothered me about it. And then I realized the voice hadn't answered my question. I'd asked how much longer, and the voice had told me my supplies were adequate. Those aren't the same thing. One is about time. The other is about capacity. The voice had told me that I could stay, not how long I would stay. And the distinction felt deliberate, like the words had been chosen carefully to give me information without giving me an answer. But then I thought, that's how bureaucracies talk. That's how government agencies respond to questions. It didn't have to mean anything, and I let it go. December, short days, long nights. The forest was wet and cold and very quiet. I kept my routes but shortened them, doing truncated versions that covered the easier terrain and avoided the steeper sections. This was, again, practical and consistent with winter protocols, but it also meant I was seeing less of the basin. My world was shrinking. Cabin, nearby trails, creek crossing, cabin. A small loop, repeated daily, each day identical to the last. I stopped writing in my separate notebook. I told myself it was because I'd run out of pages, which was true, but I also could have used the backs of the pages, or written smaller, or used the margins. The truth is that the notebook had become something I was afraid of, not the notebook itself, the information in it, all those anomalies, all those questions, all those observations that didn't connect. The notebook was a record of a mind trying to understand something, and the record was damning. Not because it contained evidence of anything external, but because it showed, in my own handwriting, the progressive deterioration of a coherent world. Each entry was a crack. Together they were something I didn't want to look at. I put the notebook in the bottom of my pack. I didn't throw it away. I couldn't throw it away, but I didn't open it. On December 14th, I woke up and went outside, and the cabin was in the wrong place. Let me try to say that more carefully. The cabin was where it had always been, but the clearing around it was different. The tree line was closer on the north side. The stump where I chopped wood, which had been about 15 paces from the front door, was about 10. The outhouse, which had been 30 yards into the tree line, was maybe 20. Everything was slightly closer, slightly more contained, as if the forest had taken a single slow step inward during the night. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, measuring distances with my paces. I tried to compare them to my memory of earlier measurements, but I hadn't measured the clearing systematically when I arrived, because why would I? It was a clearing, a fixed thing, a known quantity. You don't measure things you trust. I went back inside and sat on the cot, and I thought, very carefully, about what I wanted to do. I could measure everything now, and then measure it again tomorrow and see if anything changed. That would be the systematic, rational thing to do. That would be the thing a scientist would do. But I knew with a certainty that I cannot justify, but that was absolute. That if I did that, the measurements would match. Tomorrow would confirm today, and the next day would confirm tomorrow. And then, one morning, a week later, everything would be slightly different again, and the new measurements would contradict the old ones, and I would be back where I started, except with more data and less certainty. The thought occurred to me, and this is the thought I keep coming back to, that the problem wasn't the clearing. The problem wasn't the missing vegetation, or the extra trail markers, or the shifting creek levels, or the wrong trees, or the disappearing clearing on Route A, or the time gaps, or the lost memories. The problem was me. The problem was that I kept trying to make sense of it. Every time I measured something, the measurements destabilized what I thought I knew. Every time I compared observations, the comparison revealed contradictions. Every time I tried to hold two facts together, the facts pulled apart. The act of analysis was the problem. The act of thinking was what generated the inconsistencies. If I just walked the trails and didn't compare, if I just looked at the forest and didn't remember what it had looked like yesterday, if I just lived in the present and didn't try to construct a timeline, everything was fine. Everything was always fine. In the present moment, right now. It was only when I reached backward into memory or forward into expectation that things fell apart. I don't know if that's true. I want to be clear about that. I don't know if that's a real insight about the nature of this place, or if it's just the final rationalization of a mind that has been slowly trained to stop working. I don't know the difference. I'm not sure there is a difference. Maybe the two things are the same, and the fact that I can't tell them apart is itself part of the problem. And the fact that I'm identifying it as a problem is making the problem worse, and around and around and around. You see what happens? You see how the thinking eats itself? I want to tell you about the last thing that happened before I wrote this. It was early January. I was hiking what I believed to be Route B. I was in the western section, up on the ridge, and the day was clear and cold, and for the first time in months, I could see a long way. The canopy opened up on the ridgeline, and I could look out over the interior of the basin. I stopped and looked. The basin spread out below me, forested and green even in winter, contoured with ridges and valleys and the thin silver line of the creek winding through it. It was beautiful. It looked exactly like the map. Every ridge, every valley, every contour corresponded to what I knew. But there was something else. In the interior, in the approximate location of one of the red zones, there was a place where the trees looked slightly different. Not a different species or a different color, just slightly different, slightly wrong. The way a word looks wrong if you stare at it too long. The way your own face looks wrong in a mirror if you look too closely. It was a subtle, deep wrongness that I could feel more than see. And when I tried to focus on it, to narrow my eyes and really examine it, my vision seemed to slide off it. My attention wouldn't stick. It was like trying to look at something in your peripheral vision. The harder you try, the less you see. I stood on that ridge for a long time. The wind was blowing, and I was cold, and I knew I should keep moving. But I stood there, and I let myself feel the wrongness. I didn't try to analyze it. I didn't try to understand it. I just stood there and felt it, the way you'd stand in front of a fire and feel the heat, not needing to understand combustion, just knowing that you were warm and the fire was real. Then I walked back. I hiked down from the ridge, and I returned to the cabin, and I sat at the table. I didn't open my log. I didn't write anything down. I just sat there in the cabin that might have been smaller than it was in March, in the clearing that might have been narrower, listening to the quiet that might have been quieter. I thought about Carla Devereaux, who had given me this assignment and then gone on leave. I thought about the voice, or voices at dispatch. I thought about the folder with the thin sheaf of papers and the red zones that nobody would explain. I thought about the phrase, log it and continue, and how it had become the operating principle of my entire life. And I thought about the question I keep not finishing. The one that starts with, what if, and then dissolves. I let myself get a little closer to it this time. What if the basin is not a place that follows consistent rules? What if the inconsistencies are not errors, but features? What if the monitoring assignment is not designed to understand the area, but to prevent anyone from understanding it, not by forbidding inquiry, but by structuring work so that inquiry is always just slightly more effort than acceptance? What if the form with the anomaly field is not a tool for tracking anomalies, but a release valve, a way to let the dissonance out in small, manageable amounts so it never accumulates into actual understanding? What if I was chosen for this job not because I'm stable and low reactive, but because stable, low reactive people are the ones who will keep logging anomalies and keep walking day after day, month after month, until the act of walking becomes more real than the things they're walking through? I don't know. I don't know any of it. And I've noticed that the not knowing has settled into me like sediment, like something deposited by a very slow, very patient current. I don't fight it anymore. I don't try to piece things together. I do my routes. I write my logs. I talk to dispatch on Thursdays. I eat, sleep, chop wood, read my spy novel, which I've now read 3 times, and which keeps me exactly as absorbed as I need it to. I'm okay. I want to say that clearly. I'm okay. I'm functional. I'm doing my work. The basin is quiet. The trails are clear. The creek is at whatever level it's at. The markers are whatever number they are. The clearing on Route A is either there or not there, and I'll find out when I walk through it. And then I'll know, and then I won't compare it to last time. I've been monitoring this area for 10 months now, or 11. My log says 10, my memory says 11. There was a month in there somewhere. I'm not sure which one. That feels both too long and too short, like it happened twice or not at all. I could go through my logs and count the entries and figure out the exact timeline, but I won't. I already know what would happen if I did. The numbers would be slightly off. The dates would almost add up, but not quite. There would be an entry I don't remember writing, or a gap where an entry should be, or a Thursday report that dispatch has a record of and I don't. And then I'd have another anomaly, and I'd log it, and I'd continue. The last thing I want to say is this: last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago, I'm not certain. I was lying in the cot at night, not sleeping, not quite awake, and I had a thought that came to me fully formed, without preamble, the way a stone drops into still water. The thought was, I have been thinking about this wrong. There is nothing to understand. The inconsistencies are not clues. They are not evidence. They are not pieces of a puzzle. There is no puzzle. There is only the basin, and the trails, and the work, and the days, and me. And the more I look for something behind that, the less I will be able to see what's in front of me. And the thought felt true. It felt deeply, profoundly, restfully true, and I almost fell asleep in the warmth of it. But then, just before sleep took me, another thought came. Smaller, quieter, almost inaudible, like a voice from very far away. And the thought was, that's exactly what it wants you to think. I opened my eyes. I lay in the dark. The cabin was silent. The forest was silent. The basin was out there, all around me, enormous and dark and very still. I closed my eyes again. In the morning, I felt fine. I got up, I made coffee, I chose a route, I walked. I'm still walking.